airline travel is wonderful. It's very pleasant. The prices are dropping as the technology and the sort of like uptake by Americans is increasing. So why did we deregulate in I guess it was by 1978? Why did that happen? And what were the forces? Because it's sort of surprising to me, actually, because I'm always looking for the big money sources here, and that really isn't part of the or a major part of the story. It seems like.
Yeah, I think the story in the 1970s is really that there was a kind of perfect storm for this massive upheaval and change. And on the one side, the kind of precipitating conditions was the economic crisis of the early 70s. You had OPEC, you had the oil shocks, you have high inflation. That, of course, means fewer people are going to fly, so you have lower demand for flying. At the same time that pops up, plus the higher oil costs, of course, you also have in the late 60s, the airlines that had spent all this money on buying new fleets of wide-bodied jets, this new exciting technology. And that's a good thing. We want them to be improving on that. And the way that the regulatory system handled improvements to technology and capital expenses is that they could build in part of their capital expenditure into the prices, so that they could make back the costs that they spent to upgrade all the planes. Makes total sense. And so the airlines come and they ask the regulators to increase the price a little bit. And that's going on at the same time as these other shocks. And so that's one thing where people are saying, hey, wait, it seems like airline prices are high, even though there were some good reasons for it. The other thing that was happening was just a really striking intellectual set of shifts and political set of shifts. And so on the one hand, maybe predictably, you had a number of conservatives who were more free market-y Chicago school economic folks thinking all regulation is bad. We got to get big government out of the way. This kind of regulatory system seems like a government-sponsored cartel. We should just let the market work. The market does a great job at everything. And that was kind of one approach. But what's maybe more surprising is that there were a bunch of liberals who were on board with that approach. Ralph Nader, Ted Kennedy, supported by Stephen Breyer, later Supreme Court Justice, but then Kennedy's chief advisor. And what their argument was that this kind of government-regulated system was harming consumers, and that if we moved to a more market approach and deregulated, this would be better for consumers and prices would go down, really pulling on these conservative market-based approaches. And they bought into that too. And so the combination of those things meant that you ended up with this kind of strange coalition in the 70s that ultimately led to Jimmy Carter signing the Airline Deregulation Act. And to be fair, the pitch that they brought to the table sounded pretty good. It was, if you deregulate the airlines, you're going to have lower prices, more competition, and no bad things are going to happen. You're not going to have losses of service or a problem for labor or any issues on safety, and everything will be just fine. Will just be better because it'll be even cheaper and there'll be even more competition. At one point, one person predicted there would be up to 200 airlines operating in a competitive environment. That was the kind of, utopia that they imagined with deregulation, and Congress bought it over some dissents. I mean, notably the airline industry and some perhaps surprising folks, Barry Goldwater, Republican from Arizona, not usually associated with the regulation, were opposed to this and pointed out some of the problems that might emerge with deregulation. And so I think it was a weird moment of these kind of odd coalitions.
It's so strange. Because it's so different than our politics today. It feels like, in terms of like what forces operate on something like that. What was the track record up until the 70s with government sort of like unplanned? I mean, the subsidies came in insofar as like we're given some, the post office helped built that. I guess that's prior to this time. But there's also, we're subsidizing because we're raising money to build airports, and we're subsidizing it insofar as we're running the market and we're protecting you from shocks and this and that. What was the, did there need to be bailouts before this? Because this one crisis of like, it's like an end of history crisis, it feels like. And then, of course, like all those neo-libertarians from Chicago and Milton Friedman are just ready there with this sort of like, maybe freshman in college, ready-made answer that sounds like it's going to work. And some people bought it.
Yeah, in a way, it's really interesting because one of the great successes of regulation was weaning the big airlines off subsidies, which they had been getting from basically the dawn of the airline. I mean, not exactly the Wright brothers, but a little bit after that, all the way through. And by the late 50s, the cab has gotten it to a place where the big airlines don't need subsidies anymore. And that's one of the real strengths of this period, is that you actually move away from that model of needing the subsidies and toward the airlines standing on their own 2 feet in a reliable and stable way. So I think that's another one of the great success stories of the period that rarely gets told.
Okay. So, and there's also an element we should say that there was an example in California and Texas of like, because these were airlines that were within a state, and these states are obviously big enough to justify having an airline that could operate just within a state. Southwest, I think, was one of those. They were not regulated by the federal government, and they were operating, and so that gave like a poor analogy. It turns out, but an analogy as to like how this could work in the entire country, and. So let's jump ahead. So they think that this is going to bring about an era where we're going to keep all the stuff that we've had at this point under regulation, but we're just going to have more airlines. It's just going to be cheaper. People are going to have more choice in the marketplace. What happens? And it happens pretty quick, doesn't it?
Yeah. So deregulation happens really fast, right away after 78 in the first couple of years. And what the consequence is immediately you end up not in the kind of utopia that the deregulators predicted, but in a kind of Hunger Games for like a decade from 78 till the late 80s. And in that period, at first, what you get looks pretty good. You get a whole bunch of new airlines coming in. There's airlines like People Express that start up and that are offering new kind of service. There's New York Air. There's dozens of these airlines.
Didn't Trump have an airline too? I feel like
he did by the late 80s, a little bit later in the 80s, tried to do that and got in on potentially buying some other airlines. But in that period, early in the 80s, you had all these new entrants coming in, and they were coming in without unionized workforces. They were coming in not to Alaska or small towns in Kansas, but instead were flying primarily to big cities. So you would have, airlines recognizing, hey, Boston, New York, DC, that's a really popular corridor. Let's take that and start flying there. And they start competing. They're dropping prices because they're just serving in these places. They're trying to get market share. We have these good competitive fare wars. And then the big airlines, they've got some weapons too, and they decide to fight back. And so what the big airlines do is they start serving those same routes also. And they drop their prices to compete or even beat the new entrants, sometimes pricing below the cost of flights. And they'll even sandwich flights. And what that means is basically if you're a new entrant, if you're People Express and you're flying, New York to Detroit at 9 a.m., you might get another airline coming in and flying at 8:58 and 9:02. And so why would you ever, as a passenger, want to take this new no frills airline that has, not the good meal, not the good service at 9 a.m. when for the same price or cheaper, I could fly American or Delta or whatever, one of the big airlines with a lot better service with these big networks. And I can just fly them at 8:58 instead of 9 or 9:02 instead of 9. And what that did was it pushed out these smaller airlines. And that was one of the tools they used. They also created frequent flyer programs, which were an anti-competitive tool designed as such. I mean, pretty obviously, the whole point of it is that you fly that same airline instead of flying a competitor. It's designed to keep you with that airline. That emerged in the 80s. And people in the 80s thought these were anti-competitive and a form of white-collar crime even, that they shouldn't be allowed for that reason. But that emerged as well. And so by the end of the 80s, what you ended up with was dozens of mergers and bankruptcies that led to reconsolidation of the airline industry into basically the same big players running the show as ran it under regulation. They just now were unregulated. And that had some really important consequences even over the course of the 80s, because what the airlines did was they partly really put pressure to squeeze labor to reduce their costs. And so they ended up with...
I was going to ask the difference between labor, union density pre, let's say 78 and post, 88.
Yeah. So one of the things that happens is, these new entrants come in without unions. And so the old airlines need to figure out what to do with that. And so when there are mergers or bankruptcies, they put a lot of pressure on the airline unions to cut their pay and benefits. One airline, American, actually created a system of B scales, which was basically if you were grandfathered in and already worked at the industry, you made whatever those benefits were. But any new employee got put on the B scale, which was lower benefits and salary going forward. So there were different ways they tried to do that as a way to shrink costs. That wasn't how the system worked under regulation. And then they massively restructured their routes. So instead of airlines serving all these different kind of routes with a lot of nonstop point-to-point service, you had airlines increasingly moving toward a hub and spokes model. And that's just a fancy way of recognizing that if you fly on Delta, you connect through Atlanta. And it's because they move all their stuff to Atlanta. It's more efficient for them. Ground crews, everything else, they can concentrate in one place. It's a little bit more irritating for passengers because for a lot of passengers, it means you have to connect where you might have had a point-to-point nonstop service. Of course, for some passengers, if you were in very remote places, maybe it's a little bit better because if you're in a remote place and you can get to Atlanta in one flight, you then have access to a lot of other flights. But that was the big shift, this kind of move to these hub and spoke systems also over time, which really reshaped the geography of our airline industry, of airports, and over time of economic growth and I think inequality in our country too. Because when you have concentration of airports and you lose a hub, think about your St. Louis's, your Cincinnati's, to lose a hub is a real downside for a city. Who wants to start a Fortune 500 company in a city that doesn't have any air service? And if you think about it one step further, do you really want to start it in a city that doesn't have that much air service? A lot better to be in a place with a lot of basic transportation infrastructure. So I think it's had a lot of consequences, and that was basically predicted by the people who were opposed to deregulation, and admitted by the proponents of it by the 1980s, by the end of the 80s. And that to me is one of the striking stories here that almost never gets told, is that the proponents of deregulation, like Alfred Kahn, even though he never said he was wrong, he admitted that airline prices hadn't gone down everywhere. They'd gone up in some places and down in others, that there had been this move to hub and spokes, that there had been massive consolidation and monopolistic exploitation, admitted all of these things by the late 80s.
It really is amazing the knock-on impact of this too. In addition to it sucks to fly. I mean, that's literally your title of your book. But the labor density issue, and I wonder how much of, if in the course of your research into this, that in the 1970s, there began this sort of hostility within the Democratic Party, in certain parts of the Democratic Party, to organized labor and unions, right? I mean, you have the McGovern Commission that sort of changes the way that the primaries happened and made a more democratic, small d democratic, but also was meant to sort of, take some of the power away from labor unions. We are just years away from by the time we deregulate, from Reagan breaking the PATCO union with the air traffic controllers. Was that a question? I mean, I don't perceive Ted Kennedy, although I don't really know, as being necessarily hostile to labor. Stephen Breyer, I don't think is a particular champion or was as a Supreme Court justice to labor, if I remember correctly. But how much of that played in this sort of like stew that pushed the deregulation?
So I don't think that the challenges and problems that labor would face after deregulation from the airlines were a kind of major motivating factor for some of the proponents of airline deregulation. They may have kind of willfully been blind to what was going to happen. I mean, I described this in the book, a couple of little stories from the book. One is, one of the heads of the airlines says to Congress that this is going to be basically an assault on labor if you deregulate the airlines. He then later, as head of one of these airlines, becomes one of the main people assaulting labor in the 1980s, and is deeply hated by the labor unions by the late 80s and by workers in the whole industry. A guy named Frank Lorenzo. But he said that's what was going to happen. I mean, so there was some notice that this is what was going to happen. But I think they were not motivated by it, in part because there's another story that I have in the book of Ted Kennedy, who, almost a decade after deregulation, meets at some cocktail party or something, one of his former aides who worked with him on the deregulation project in the 70s, sees him and, goes up to him, and the guy comes up to him just to say hi to, his old boss, Kennedy. And Kennedy just starts like yelling at him basically about deregulation and saying how it's been crushing the unions. And you promised to me that the unions would be for this and that it would be good, it would be okay for labor. And that's not what's happening. And he went on about this, and, I don't know if he regretted it fully, but he certainly seemed like he was quite, in the reports of that conversation, was quite exercised on behalf of labor that this had been a real problem. And so I think there's a real story there that, whether or not it was motivated, it is something that contributed and that, probably wasn't taken anywhere near as seriously, certainly by some of the proponents as it should have been.
It's just so hard, I think, having a political awareness in this era and contemplating such a massive change like that without there being, some huge pot of money that somebody thinks that they're going to make. And even the people who were going to make it were sort of against it on some level. And then just these knock-on things, the financialization of these airlines, they're basically functioning as like, half their business, it feels like is some type of like credit deals that they're making with credit cards over these airlines. And then I think like that untold story of what it's done in terms of not only wealth disparity in terms of cities, increasing the rural urban divide in this country. I think you could also trace the sort of like why Congress has become so stratified, where you have now, 10 years ago you had, or 20 years ago, you had 250 seats that were up for grabs at any point in the House. And now it's down to like a dozen or two that are up for grabs because people self-sort based upon their desire to travel and to get to places and the type of business they do. Let's also I want to touch on this before we get to the final part of your one possible solution that you have to this, is this notion of common ownership, where there is a de facto coordination, maybe de facto is the wrong word, a coordination amongst the airlines so that they have really developed an oligopoly. Now we're back to where we were, except for without the regulation that makes sure that they don't function as an oligopoly or have that type of ability to sort of screw over consumers, but also society and citizens insofar as these knock-on impacts.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you see is that we just have a lot less competition in the airline industry nowadays. And there's a bunch of ways that works. One is if you just think about cities, if you're a city that only has service from one or two airlines, that's low levels of competition. That usually means higher prices, worse quality of service. If you're a big hub, if you're flying to or from one of these big hubs, you also pay higher prices and will have probably challenges too because of the monopolization at these hubs. airlines now in some cases will have 70, 80% of a city. What that means is that if you want to go anywhere and from that city, you can fly direct on that airline, or you can connect using some other airline. Well, you're going to fly direct. And then when you add to that in some ways, the big three don't really compete. And even Southwest also, if you've ever noticed, prices always seem to be basically the same between so-called competitor airlines if you're flying to some places. That's part of that story. And what some economists have shown is that part of the reason for that is that their ownership is the same. So the folks who own, say, 25% of one airline also maybe own 30% of another one and 20% of a third one. And what that means is that the airline managers understand that if what you care about is benefits to your shareholders, and your shareholders are overlapping, well, then they don't actually benefit if you compete. They actually benefit if you collude. And so there's an incentive there, and nobody needs to have a, hidden conversation in a smoke-filled back room or something. Like, everyone just understands that's how it works. And so that also can encourage, folks have suggested, this kind of anti-competitive behavior. So in a bunch of ways, we have less competition now. And even at the big level, when you look at it, the biggest four airlines in the country have a larger market share now than they did in the 1970s under regulation. I mean, that's astonishing.
Those investors, yeah. And these investors aren't, they're not individual. These are big institutional investors, right? I mean, that like whatever it is, some massive hedge fund owns 20% of you and 20% of Delta and 20% of whatever it is. And that's the way it works there.
And that's, I think it's a real challenge. And there's some law professors who've argued this is straightforwardly a violation of the antitrust laws and something that we need to grapple with.
Okay, so your one of the things that you talk about in dealing with this is not re-regulation necessarily. Although, I mean, I wonder how possible you think that is, but the idea of introducing basically a public option, which is sort of like on some level modeled from what was proposed in the initial Affordable Care Act, actually. In some respects, that put in another competitor into the marketplace. But tell us about that one and why not re-regulate?
Yeah, so in the book, I try to expand our imagination in a bunch of ways about how we think about airline policy, because I think part of the challenge is for almost everyone, I think we just think that this is something we have to live with. The crummy service, the small seats, the lack of access, the higher prices, the fewer flights. I mean, all of this is just a pain and there's nothing we can do. It's just how it is. And I want us to think that that's not true, that I want us to realize like we can do something about this and we need to be more imaginative. And so, I don't talk in detail about re-regulation per se in the book because, part of the book, as we've talked about here, is really about the history of regulation and how it worked. And so it's pretty evident how we could just go back to that. But what I want to do is explore some other opportunities and other ways we could think about this. I talk about having a single national carrier, the kind of post office model, just one, it's a monopoly, it's national. That's an approach. There's the old AT&T model. It's one, it's regulated, but it's private. And so still one carrier. And those two things help us think about what would be the pros and cons of a single national system where you truly have universal scale. That's interesting, but it's also problematic. There's no competition. Maybe there would be some downsides to innovation in those contexts. I think a public option is another approach that could be interesting, as you mentioned, where you could imagine having a public carrier alongside a private carrier. That's actually the model Australia had for a long time, their two-airline policy. And the nice thing about that is the public carrier will ensure that the private actor stays competitive on price. The private actor will ensure that the public carrier stays pretty decent on quality. And you can imagine that kind of two-party competition dynamic working. But, I ultimately, I don't think that approach or nationalization is likely in the short term or even medium term. And so what I really focus on is systems of regulated competition that draw from the history that we have and are inspired by them, but try to solve some of the most acute problems that we face today. My hope is that some of those things, even if they're not as bold, might actually be able to get bipartisan interest from people all around the country.
If you had, let's say, a public airline, we call it public airline, and it is run, or the government pays for it, and they the only difference is there's no the board of directors does not they're not shareholders per se. And how would that compete against airlines that don't have the responsibility that presumably a public one would, to like, we're going to hit every airport, like we're going to service every airport in the country, or we're going to, including regional airports, let's say. How would that compete? Or it just would need certain amount of subsidies, but I guess we would make it back. We wouldn't have to have bailouts as much because this airline goes under. That's all right. And then we just have more business on public airlines.
Well, the way it worked in Australia, which I think would be the kind of model for this, is you would have to standardize a bunch of the terms, which would mean flying to certain cities. And in the Australia one, the airlines, the public and the private, had to fly to all the same cities, and they had, some similarities in what their mandates were, and then they could compete within that. And so that was a place where, if the private sector could do better, it would do better, but they weren't allowed to do better by dropping a bunch of cities that we want to have service. So that's the way you would have to solve that problem.
It's really the fascinating stuff, and I think it's really helpful for people to sort of get a grip of what is possible, and just the idea. I mean, you're the director of a center that has political economy in its name, and this is a prime example of like all of these things are just decisions that we make, that the economy does not exist in nature. You don't pick it off a tree. We're creating it. I really appreciate you coming on. Ganesh Sitaraman, law professor at Vanderbilt University. The book is Why Flying is Miserable and How to Fix It. Thanks so much for your time today. We'll put a link to that at majority.fm and our podcast and YouTube descriptions.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.